When you picture the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, what comes to mind? Probably someone serene, wise, a moral guide for, millions of people. But what if I told you that history tells a very different story? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on some of the most shocking figures to ever wear that white cassock. Yeah, you can forget serenity and wisdom. This explainer is all about paranoia, greed, and yes, even murder. We are talking about popes who sold the highest office in the church for a bag of gold, ran the Vatican like a crime family, and, I promise you I am not making this up, put a 7-month-old corpse on trial. You've heard the saying, right? That history is stranger than fiction? Well, sometimes it's also way more brutal. We're about to meet 3 men who pushed the Catholic Church to the absolute brink of survival. So, buckle up. Okay, our first stop takes us all the way back to the 9th century for what has to be the single most bizarre legal case in all of human history. The man at the center of it all is Pope Stephen VI, a guy whose grudge against the Pope before him, Formosus, went way, way beyond the grave. Here's the catch for Stephen. Formosus had already been dead and buried for 7 months. Now, most people would probably just let that go. But Stephen? Nope, he was not most people. His obsession led to one of the most grotesque and infamous events in papal history, the Cadaver Synod. The whole process was just completely unhinged. Stephen had Formosus's rotting body dug up, dressed in the full papal robes, and propped up on a throne to actually stand trial. He then stood there and screamed charges of perjury at its silent, decomposing vase. And get this, a terrified young deacon was forced to hide behind the corpse and whisper answers for the defense. And, spoiler alert, the corpse lost the case. Stephen declared him guilty, had the body stripped, chopped off the 3 fingers he'd used for blessings, and then had him chucked into the Tiber River. But here's the karmic twist. The people of Rome were so horrified by this whole spectacle that they rose up, threw Stephen in prison, and had him strangled to death just a few months later. All right, our next unholy pope takes us in a totally different direction. If Stephen VI was driven by some kind of bizarre post-mortem rage, Pope Benedict IX was, he was basically just a spoiled brat who was handed absolute power. The most shocking thing about Benedict was just how young he was. Historians argue about the exact number, but he was probably in his late teens or early 20s when he first became pope. I mean, just imagine giving a college frat brother total religious and political authority over Europe. That's pretty much what happened here. And he quickly earned a pretty nasty reputation. The future saint, Peter Damian, did not mince words, calling him, and I quote, a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. Benedict was accused of everything, theft, murder, and basically treating the papacy like his own personal ATM, throwing these wild parties in the Lateran Palace. Now this brings us to a really key concept you have to understand for this era, simony. It's just a fancy word for the buying or selling of church offices or holy privileges. And Benedict, he was about to take this practice to a whole new level. He is the only person in all of history to have been the Pope on 3 separate occasions. Mostly because the first time, he sold the job. He literally sold the office of the papacy to his own godfather for a huge pile of gold, supposedly because he wanted to get married. He then decided he regretted it and came back to fight for the throne all over again. And finally, we arrive at the heavyweight champion of papal controversy. If Benedict was just an unruly teenager, our final pope, Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, was like a seasoned mob boss. He didn't just stumble into corruption, he built an empire out of it. Alexander bought his way into the papacy with massive bribes. He then used the full power of the church, not for spiritual stuff, but to build a political empire for his illegitimate children, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. He hosted parties that became legendary for just how wild they were, and he had a permanent solution for dealing with his rivals. To give you just a little taste of his reign, contemporary accounts describe parties like the Banquet of Chestnuts. It was an event so notoriously scandalous that, you should probably just Google it yourself if you're curious. It paints a pretty clear picture of what the Vatican was like under his leadership.
And for anyone who stood in the Borgia family's way, well, their enemies had this nasty habit of dying very suddenly right after dinner. The weapon of choice was a legendary poison known as cantarella. Under Alexander VI, the Vatican wasn't really a church so much as it was a cartel headquarters. So, after hearing all these stories of madness, greed, and organized crime, this huge question just sort of hangs in the air. How on earth did an institution like the Catholic Church survive leaders like these? And honestly, that's the truly fascinating part of this story.
Let's just summarize what we've seen. We have a paranoid man who put a dead body on trial. We have a spoiled kid who sold the highest office in Christendom. And we have a ruthless crime boss who ran a political cartel from the throne of St. Peter. These were, by any and every measure, the worst pilots imaginable.
And yet, here's the great paradox. While these men were busy being terrible, the institution itself didn't collapse. In fact, during the reign of the super-corrupt Alexander VI, Michelangelo was just down the road sculpting the magnificent Pietà. Somehow, the machinery of faith and art and knowledge just kept on turning. And what all this really points to is a powerful historical lesson, the distinction between the office and the man holding it. The systems, the beliefs, the structures of the era were often so robust, or maybe just so stubborn, that they could survive even the most disastrous individuals at the very top.
These stories are such a stark reminder that historical figures, even the ones we call holy, weren't just marble statues. They were complex, ambitious, and sometimes truly awful people who were given immense power with almost no accountability whatsoever. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If future historians were to look back on our time 500 years from now and write about the leaders of today, who do you think would make their list of the most controversial? It's a sobering question when you think about it.